So my name is Krystle Portocarrero, and I am a product manager here at Juniper Networks, focusing really a lot on our advanced threat prevention and just general threat detection products. So today we're going to talk a little bit about adaptive threat profiling. So when it comes to all of the different challenges I think organizations face, there's remote work, there's expansions to the cloud, there is a ever-growing attack surface, and the impact that this scope creep kind of adds to the amount of security risks that are potentially out there. So when it comes to security, a lot of things we're going to focus on here, at least this morning, is really looking at kind of two things, right? Because with everything connected, security really has to be woven into the fabric of the infrastructure itself, right? To ensure, obviously, the basics, right? As a security vendor, we have to provide visibility and security, right, against all of the different cyber attacks that are out there so you can manage your risk better, right? But security is only really one aspect of this entire battle, because as you add new features, new widgets, new sensors, right, which is something that the security, I think, as an industry has done a lot over the years, it really adds a lot of complexity, and complexity only adds to that risk, right, in and of itself. You know, how many times have you read a story about a breach that was made public where some alarm was going off somewhere, but nobody heard it over all of the noise, right? The amount of complexity, the amount of alerts, all of those things really add to the risks, right, that all these cyber attacks pose as well. Because you need to find them, but you actually need to be able to listen, right, and find that alert when it happens and be really more proactive about management. And so I think, as an industry, we really have to do better. And so one of the things you want to make sure to do is offer security solutions, right, that not only do the basics, right, of security and find those cyber attacks, find what's interesting, right, in your network traffic, but also reduce complexity to ensure that we kind of stay true to our North Star, which is, of course, there you go, user experience. Right? And not only users, like the end users who are leveraging the networks we build and secure, but more importantly, the network and security operators who have their hands full, often just trying to keep the lights on. And so with the kind of mass amount of data kind of at your fingertips at any point in time, it can be really difficult to find the signal kind of in the noise. And this isn't really meant to be a talk about alert fatigue. We can have that another day. We have a lot of thoughts on that one in general. But the point is that flow data, network alarms, and threat information do not equal intelligence, right? To actually have real intelligence, you need context, you need validation, right? How do you make that information available and consumable while not adding complexity? And that's really like the big question here, right? Because user experience is still key. Connectivity for legitimate services for users and devices is crucial to keeping a business kind of up and running. And downtime for any reason isn't cute, whether it's the LAN, the WAN, right, network type issues, or a security event. And so we talk about threat intelligence. Before we go too far into it, I want to define a couple of things, right? Because threat intelligence can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. And so there's the Gartner definition here, but I think at a high level, really what threat intelligence is, it's the knowledge that allows you to prevent and mitigate attacks, right? It's rooted in data, it's threat kind of intel that provides context like who is attacking you, what their motivations and capabilities might be, which would help you on the defense side, and then what indicators maybe of compromise are you looking for to stop. So you can look at it kind of from four kind of pillars, where you have strategic intelligence, and that may be something that a board member or a CISO looks at, right? And you might say, hey, the fact that we're a financial institution, there may be intel available kind of that doesn't change a whole lot over time. It just gives you an example of like general trends of who may be targeting others in the financial industry. And when you take that information, you go down to the next level with tactical intelligence, right? How do you translate that down to, say, an IT administrator or a SOC manager that says, hey, okay, so now we know that these are, maybe some of the specific APT groups, there we go, that could be targeting us. Something like the Lazarus Group, right? They're known to target banks. I pulled up some of the largest heists, right, in history. So what are the tactics, techniques, and procedures they may be using? And then do you have defenses against that, right? And then that's the next part. It gets handed off maybe to a security manager or a network defense team to figure out how do you take that operational intelligence, right, and make it actionable. So there's a lot of short-term details here, like what types of malware may they use, what exploits are they using at this particular point in time, because things will change, right, over time with any given threat. And then the last piece is technical, right, the technical intelligence. And finally, you have a network or security operator that has to take that specific what and do something with it, whether it's a malware hash, a C2 IP that you just want to block. But going from kind of the strategic intelligence level all the way down to the technical intelligence level can be really difficult. It often requires high touch to make it relevant and useful. And I think it's because we often really focus just on kind of the last piece. Every vendor, including Juniper, right, has some manner of threat feeds available, and they're always based on what happened yesterday in security. And then you might use another vendor to add historical context, and yet another vendor to drown out some of the noise so you only are seeing what's relevant to you. And so that's where adaptive threat profiling can come in and help, right? Because what it does is it provides, I like to think of as 100% organic farm-to-table threat intelligence that's really unique to your specific organization. It allows you to figure out what's risky, what's suspicious, or even just what's interesting on your network, not just in general with security, right? That type of intelligence is useful, but what's happening on your network right now that you should be aware of. So it's able to kind of leverage these intelligence feeds in our cloud infrastructure to give you an easy way to really be more proactive rather than reactive when it comes to the management. This is all comes at no additional infrastructure or cost, which is a huge bonus always. You can use the SRX as a sensor on your network. You can deploy it anywhere, whether it's a physical firewall living at the edge or a virtual firewall, set all over the place for micro-segmentation, or even a containerized firewall. You can use these as simple sensors on your network as well. And when you use your policy management, right, to set up what's interesting to you, and then what do you want to do with that, right, once you've found it, and make sure you have these consistent policies that are really enforced across the entire network using a set of pre-staged policies for both interest and intent. And so, okay, right, you say to Krystle, we've already heard about this. We actually already use it. It's been out for like 2 years. And I know 2020 doesn't see, it seems like it wasn't that long ago, and maybe it's a year that a lot of us would rather forget. But we've, the reason why we're here talking about it today is because there's a lot of changes we've had, right? And so we've made some improvements not only to the service, but we've learned a lot about how people want to use it from our customers directly as well. So it's not only effective for security operators, but it's also now effective for the network side of the house as well, and our network operators. Because the firewall at its core, right, the firewall is a great product in that it's kind of a jack of all trades, right? There's a lot of information you can glean based off of your kind of tried and true security services, whether it's just like your 5-tuple matching, looking at source and destination IPs and ports, right? Looking at URL categories or application signatures. And then taking that even to some more specific security use cases, you can start to look at anomalies and exploit detection. So we can take all of this information and start to create what's interesting to you today on your network, and then create these unique feeds that are based off of what's happening at this current time, store them up in our cloud infrastructure, keep them up to date so they automatically will have things that fall off based off a TTL value. And then you have policies that use them to then do things like add some further inspection, maybe rate limit traffic, right? Or block or quarantine the incidents at, not only the firewall level, but at other kind of enforcement points, whether it be a switch or an access point or a router even, right? So all of the new features we've added as far as the new UI, as well as giving some additional options like user-based feeds, or what we'll kind of talk about here today. And so kind of enough,
and
right?
Just a quick question. Which format do you support on the user-based feeds? Is this sticks, taxi, or can you share what kind of format they can have that you support them?
As we go into the demo here, behind the scenes, what we have kind of set up as prerequisites for this is that you already have Active Directory integrated with the firewall. So whether that's through the direct integration we have with the SRX or through something like the Juniper Identity Management Service, that's what's going to pull that user information so that we can then use it in our feeds and policies.
Is it just on-premise Active Directory or also Azure AD?
On-premise, and we can also do some integrations with Azure, and there's actually, with the identity management service specifically, there is a way to do some like syslog ingestions. So you can actually get user information, and same thing with login information from a number of different sources.
So kind of the idea is to add to the network traffic that we see also the user context, so that this is kind of an additional, let's say, info that we can track, yeah?
Exactly. All right, so then, for the demo, a couple of things just to keep in mind. What you're gonna see here is the creation of the feeds initially in ATP Cloud. Then we'll go through on the SRX and actually create some policies to detect the types of behaviors, right, that we're interested in seeing. And then you'll use those feeds in an additional, right, set of security controls and policies based off of predefined actions. So before we get into the demo, again, the Active Directory integration is already configured. We already have some IDP policies configured as well, and some basic security policies just to get traffic right through. So let me go ahead and get into the demo here. And so what we have is two different users. You'll see the user Pepper on the left and the user Steve on the right. Both of them are connecting to the network through the SRX, which is acting as a sensor now on the network, sending, right, all of that intelligence up to the ATP Cloud, where everything is correlated and collated to be sent back down. So here we're going to log into the ATP Cloud to do the first piece here and set up our profiling feeds. So you go into Configure, Adaptive Threat Profiling, and here we're going to create 3 new feed types. So the first one here is BW users for bandwidth users. Notice here we've changed the type to a user ID rather than an IP address, and the TTL is left at 1 for 1 day. The second feed type we're going to create is an IP feed, and this is our found attacker IPs. And we're going to actually up the TTL to 5 days. So this will stay on that feed for 5 days. If we don't see it again, it'll age out automatically. And then the last one is our found target IPs. Notice that there's 0 items in all of these feeds right now. If we, kind of click on either one of them, you'll see that there's nothing in there right now because we just created them. I wouldn't expect to see anything. And so you see the feed type and just some basic information at there. So now we're going to go ahead and log into the firewall. And from here, just check and make sure that, yes, it is actually enrolled in the cloud service, because that's going to be the first part. Can't actually add anything if we can't communicate with the ATP Cloud. So we can see here the SRX is actually enrolled. And now if we take a look at our policies, we only have 2 basic security policies right now. One that's pretty much a basic any permits. But we're going to create a new one. And this first one here is really, right, the sensor policy. This is what is going to dictate what types of, right, profiling or what types of behaviors we're interested in looking at. So our match criteria first is going to be any of our Windows PCs, right? And then we're specifically going to look for our user Steve here. We'll look for the user Pepper. And then as an additional piece here, right, we're actually going to add all of the Vault 101 users. So all the Vault dwellers are being inspected as well here. So now we have kind of, again, what we're interested in from a source perspective. On the destination side here, anything, right, anytime those users are browsing out to the internet. And specifically, we're going to look for a predefined application group that we created previously called high bandwidth application. So this is a lot of streaming media, YouTube. I think there's some news websites like CNN on there, right? Anything you'd find streaming, videos to watch, Facebook, Twitter, I think are on there as well. And then notice that the service there was HTTP, HTTPS. We're going to allow the traffic. And this is where the magic happens then as we come into our advanced services. And for threat profiling, we're going to select to add the user, right, the source user of this flow to our feed called BW users or bandwidth users. So now we've created the interest policy. we're going to create the second policy that says, what are we going to do with it, right? What is the intent? Why are we even collecting this type of information? What do we want to do with it? So now we're going to create a second policy called bandwidth restricted. And we'll go through and select our source criteria here. So again, it's the Windows PCs, and then we're going to use an identity-based feed. So this is our high bandwidth users feed. Go ahead, click OK. And then we'll go into our destination criteria, and this is going to be left fairly open. So for services, I think we'll just do any web traffic. So HTTP, HTTPS. And then finally, what is the action? We're going to permit that traffic, but now we want to do some additional things. And those things are going to be some security criteria by adding an IPS policy. We're also going to rate limit this traffic, and then turn on the threat prevention policy, which will do things like look for malware and encrypted traffic connections. Last thing is just to select the logging policy. So we'll log on session, close. And then we're going to save all of that and actually push these configuration changes out. So once we push them out, what we should see is we're going to pull up the user consoles here for both Pepper and Steve. So Pepper, again, is on the left side. Steve is on the right side. We're just going to browse the web and then take a look at what happens. So our user Pepper now is going to just browse Wikipedia, right? Nothing too crazy here. And what we should see on the firewall side, if we go into monitoring our logs, we look at the events, we should be able to see that traffic here once it loads. And you can see here, right, our user Pepper went to Wikipedia and hit the policy called unrestricted policy, right? That was that really first, kind of base policy that we'd expect. Now, if we go to one of the high bandwidth, applications, so I think in this case, we're going to go to cnn.com and browse around. That should cause, that censor policy to be hit. So if we go back to our event log now and refresh, notice here, bandwidth user censor. So the application here is CNN. You can see it's the user Pepper. So they've actually hit that second policy now. And this, that define kind of our interest. So Steve is still hitting the unrestricted policy. Pepper is hitting this bandwidth user censors policy, which should now land to her on our feed. So if we swap over to the ATP screen here, what we'll notice now is that that feed has a user in here, and it is indeed our user Pepper. You can see when it was updated and which specific firewall sent that information. Because again, this could be synced from not just one, but 20, 30, 100 different sources of intel. So now that our user is on the feed, if we try browsing again, we should be hitting that last policy that we created. So now we're just going to go to Microsoft.com, start looking around. Notice that it's loading, maybe slightly slower than before. It's kind of hard to tell. This one, there you go. Now you can kind of see it's taking a while to load the support web page here. And if we go back to our logs, we'll find out why. So we'll refresh this. And again, if we look here, let's see. Should see bandwidth restricted policy that Pepper is hitting. Steve, is still hitting our unrestricted policy. So it's not affecting him, but it is affecting the user now that's on that feed and causing them to have their bandwidth actually restricted based off that quality of service profile we applied. So if Steve browses to Reddit now, you shouldn't see any issues here. Let's do one last quick check and see anything is happening here. So he's still hitting the normal LDNS and the unrestricted policy with Reddit. So he's not having his bandwidth restricted at all. There's no throttling or anything happening. So he hasn't browsed to any of the kind of pre-configured high bandwidth usage sites.
I'm assuming here, but you saw from both users the request to the domain controller, then you tie into the domain controller query who is the user at that given point in time, and then stitch the two together. Is that a correct assumption?
Correct. Yep, that's exactly how it happens.
So if Stephen would log into a different device, you would immediately track that as well and see also that he has logged into another machine or is trying to leverage another device and so on, yeah?
Yeah, because what we do is we kind of look at two different things from the user perspective. The first is looking at user login, log out events, right, and timestamps, just to make sure that they're actually an active user on that IP address. And then we can query like LDAP basically to get their username and any roles they might have. And if they log into a new machine, we'll then map that IP address and that username to the same, right, to multiple IPs if needed.
Would it give me in the logs also the capability to track, I want to see all the machines that Steve ever used in the past?
Yeah, it should all be there in the logs. Yep. So you have your general kind of firewall logs, and then there's also kind of user and an identity logs that you can look through to get that information.
It's a bit in the user behavioral angle. You can now apply kind of these sorts of let's say search mechanism across these users, yeah? Yep,
exactly.
And then just connecting that dot back around, obviously, I mean, bandwidth restrictions, I think is an interesting way to do a demo here, makes sense, but just tying this into threat intel or threat profiling, maybe some examples of other items you can trigger on besides bandwidth.
Yep, that's what we're going to do right now.
Fantastic.
So
well,
let me.
One other thing before you move on, Steve picks up his laptop and goes to a conference room in another part of the building and gets a new IP address. You catch that?
Yep, we would catch that, right?
Because I didn't log in again. I just moved.
We should be able to catch that, and I would have to think through exactly how. So let me get back to you on that one, finish the demo right now, but that's a really good question. So from the security perspective, right, because we've done now a network, right, based one. So here what we're using now is our IPS policy, and we go into the advanced setting, and anytime we have an IPS policy now that's hit in a specific signature, what a trigger is going to do is it's going to add wherever the source of that attack is to a feed called attacker IPs. And the destination, which is the target, right, or the victim, to the, I believe it's called target IP feed is what the feed we created here. So that's the first part, is just setting that up in the actual IPS policy, adding that trigger, right? Now in this example, the IPS role, it's really just kind of an audit role. So we're just going to browse and it should automatically trigger on a few different things. So you'll see, right, the user Pepper here is just browsing to a couple different sites and that we push these config changes. And if we go to our logs again, this time we're going to take a look at threat logs instead. What we should see is some of our IPS signatures being hit once this loads. Yeah, so we can see, right, there's a number of signatures that have been hit by our user Pepper. And if we go back to our profiling feeds now and refresh, in the attacker space, we have one IP address that's been added. So that is, right, that user's machine now, because it was being used to launch these attacks. And if we go to our target, right, IP feed, this is the 4 or 5 different targets, right, of those attacks. So that's the first part. And then again, the first piece is always kind of identifying what is your intent, what are you interested in, whether it's a security or a network-based event, and then what do you want to do with it? And so that's the second part here, is we're going to create a new security policy to actually do something with that feed now that we've created it. So just to come in here, you'll notice that, again, even though we know that this machine has been used to launch some attacks, we can still, right, browse. So if we just do a continuous ping, notice that we can, right, get out to Google. And if we browse to like a Microsoft site, it's still working, right? Because nothing's been changed yet. We're just interested in this traffic. So the next part here is to come in and actually create a rule. So this is going to be our attacker block policy. And now the source of this is going to be, right, our attacker IP feed. So this is anybody that lands up on that feed. Right. And for our destination criteria, we're going to leave this pretty open. We want to kind of block them from doing anything else on the network now that we know there's an active, right, attack going on. So we'll deny that traffic and do some additional logging. So I'll save this, push out the config changes.
How dynamic is that list able to be? Meaning, because in this case, right, you're saying there's an active attack, and so you're going in and collecting those IPs and adding them to a block list. Can I have like a running list from threat intelligence that has a list of IPs I want to block and just have that always going, that updates with that, with the intelligence?
Yeah, no, that's a really, so there's a couple of things along with being able to use kind of the SRX as a sensor in this case. And you can see, right, in the example here, now that we have the attacker IP on that feed, as soon as they try to go out, again, that IP address is being blocked now. But you can actually inject kind of IP addresses or user information from a number of different sources. It can be a firewall. It could also just be using our APIs. So if you have threat intelligence coming, say, from a SIM platform where you want to pull extra information, or you are part of an ISAC, right, where you want to add that kind of intelligence in, you can actually use our APIs to create custom feeds and publish that information to ones, to either create your own separate feed or to just inject things into these feeds.
How large can these feeds be? So some of the commercial feeds have thousands, hundreds, thousands of malicious IPs inside. So what are the limitations here?
That partly depends. So on the cloud side, there's not really a whole lot of limitations because we can just keep adding, right, resources to hold the feeds. But on a per device basis, there is a feed limit, right? And so it partly depends on which platform you're looking at. Something like an SRX 300 has obviously a much smaller limit than something like our big 5800 chassis. So it's partly device based. But on the cloud side, it's fairly open. I don't know that we.
So on the smaller, just is this a couple of hundreds, 1,000? Just
I think total it might be around 1 million. So it's still fairly extensive, even on the smallest platforms.
Okay.
Yep. But that is, I think, mostly it for the demo here. So just to kind of wrap up, I wanted to just kind of cover again. Really what this whole adaptive threat profiling feature is really around is using the network to not only detect, but able to kind of enforce different policies, whether it's a network-based policy for your NetOps teams or a security-based policy, right, for the security operations. It really provides an extremely kind of flexible framework that allows you to set up types of profiling for what's interesting to you, whether it's network conditions, risky user behavior, or even malicious intent from an attacker outside of your network, and then what to do with that afterwards and make sure that's applied, consistently across the entire environment here.
How do you guys get the username to IP mapping from Active Directory?
So that comes from looking at 2 different pieces of information. The first is the domain controller logs, right, for login, log out events. And then the second is from LDAP, pulling the user information and roles that we can then map to the IPs. So it's a mixture of, what IPs are coming across the firewall, as well as login, log out events from the domain controller, and then LDAP to pull it all together.
So I assume those rules could also be written against AD groups then too?
Correct.
Just since Juniper's portfolio is so big, where does this threat profiling fit into the kind of Juniper ecosystem? What's involved from a product perspective?
Really, it's a mixture of the SRX firewall and then any number of security services that live on the firewall. So that can be, again, your kind of basic L3, L4 firewall, right? 5-tuple matching, which will come, automatically there. You get some of the application awareness or like content awareness, like from URL filtering. So those are some additional licenses. And then, of course, you also need the ATP Cloud license to actually enroll to that service. And that's what's kind of collating all of that data in one place. But you can have a mix of, say you might have some firewalls that only have, right, the base services on them, adding information to them, and then other ones that are sitting a bit more at the perimeter that are going to be more content aware, also adding things like user information or looking at specific URLs. So it really depends on what you want to do with it. That's really pretty flexible.
And then so when you're talking about kind of pulling stuff from the internal infrastructure and the domain infrastructure, is that a connection between the SRX down into the infrastructure, or is there an agent or something that gets loaded on, a server internally that's phoning back into the cloud?
It could be both. It really depends on how you want to set it up. So there's a direct integration with Active Directory from the firewall, or there is a kind of intermediate platform or an intermediate kind of piece of software called Juniper Identity Management. And that service will connect out to, it's just a more scalable version of the same service. Because at SRX, right, a single layer firewall can only connect to maybe, let's say 100 domain controllers, something like that. But with the GIM service, you can do like thousands.